Welcome to LIBS 1810, Student Success for Higher Learning. Today we're going to be discussing Chapter 7 from the college textbook, College Success. This chapter deals with interacting with instructors and participating in class. Our objectives are understanding why it's important to interact well with your professors and to participate in class, understanding why it's essential to attend classes and to actively engage in the learning process. Also preparing for and being comfortable participating in class, staying active in lecture classes to increase your learning, adapting your learning style when your professor has a different teaching style, building a relationship with your professors outside class and finding a mentor, understanding how to write professional email to professors and to others, interacting with professors of an online course and coping with difficult issues, preparing for and delivering a successful group presentation, and working with other students on a group presentation. So let's begin. It is important when you're in class that if there's something you do not understand, remember that there are probably other people in class who have the same question. So don't ever feel that a question is stupid, because if you've paid attention in class and there's something you still don't know and you've done the reading as well, there's nothing wrong with asking the professor to explain in another way. But you want to make sure that you're asking at an appropriate time. So maybe while the professor takes a pause, or during break if you don't want to ask in front of everyone else, or barring that, you can also send an email to your professor. Remember though that you want to ask a question that may be about an issue that the teacher has covered, but don't ask a question if you weren't paying attention. Now, however, if you're taking notes and you miss a point, again, don't hesitate to ask your professor to repeat the point, because there are times that we can't take notes and listen to new information at the same time. This is like asking us to multitask. So again, there's nothing wrong with asking the professor to repeat what they've just said. But you want to avoid dominating the discussion with the professor. So ask your question and then sit and listen carefully to the answer. If a classmate asks a question, the same thing is equally important. Listen carefully to the answer, because sometimes the questions that are asked, we may not even realize we don't know what the point is either. When you're in a large lecture hall with 100 students or more, you want to make sure that you're ready with your question. There may be times that the professor stops and asks if anyone has a question. So make sure that you're ready with your question. Also, if you're afraid that you're going to forget your question, write it down. And don't be shy about raising your hand. Even if English isn't your first language, the professor will probably be able to understand what your question is. And again, other students may have the same question. You also want to make sure that you're listening carefully in class so that you're not asking the same question that someone else has already asked. Because there's nothing worse for professors than answering the same question 3 or 4 times. Like I said earlier, if you're uncomfortable asking a question in a large class, ask the professor after class, or ask your professor if he or she takes questions on paper or electronically as well, because there's nothing wrong with sending your professor an email and saying, "I didn't understand this point. Could you explain it more?" Don't forget that this is also helpful to professors, because we've become experts in our own fields, and sometimes it's hard to step back and remember what it was like when we first learned this material. So if you're asking the question, it helps us, because then we can go back and review information that maybe not everybody understood. Now, teachers have various teaching styles. For example, some like to stand at the front of the class and lecture. Some like to use the whiteboards. Some like to use PowerPoint slides. Others like to use YouTube videos. But not every teacher teaches the same way, and we don't always all learn the same way. So it's important to use your own multiple intelligence to help you learn. Remember that we've looked at the multiple intelligences. So if you are one who is a logical mathematical person, maybe your professor doesn't lecture the way that you like. So set up a table or a chart. You can also form study groups and look at the additional information that your professor provides you, either on the instructional plan or what was also called a syllabus. You can also look online and see if you can find a YouTube video or any other information that further explains the topic. You can also communicate with your professor asking for an example. Or you can also approach your professor during their office hours and ask questions there. Really, we love it when students come to our office hours because it gives us a chance to get to know you, but it also gives us a chance to further explain something that we're very passionate about. There are benefits to talking to your professors, especially if you're in a larger class. Because one of the things is it helps you become more comfortable and feel more connected at the college, but also with your professor. It also helps you learn additional information about the subject or gives you a deeper understanding of the subject. You can also develop a relationship with your professor that helps when you are ready to look for jobs because we can provide letters of recommendation or we can help you network. And you can also get a better idea of how academic thinking works in North America or how society in general works as well. There are some guidelines to keep in mind when you are communicating with your professors because just like you, they're often very busy. So you want to make sure you prepare before you're going to the professor's office. Have a list of questions. Introduce yourself, especially at the beginning of the semester. Don't just use your name, but tell them which course you're taking and preferably which section you're in as well, because some professors teach more than one course. You also want to respect the professor's time and realize that the professor will probably recognize your face. Try to see things as well from the professor's point of view and don't pretend that you've done something that you haven't, because we can often tell. So for example, if you haven't done a key reading and you have questions about it and you want us to basically tell you about what the article is, don't pretend that you've already read it. Remember that while we enjoy talking about what we're teaching, we don't enjoy having to reteach a whole lesson because you have missed a class or you weren't paying attention in class. Always be professional when you're talking to your professor as well. While we are very relaxed in North America and more casual than many other countries, do remember that this is a professional relationship that you have. So you don't want to talk to them like they are your friends. You want to keep your language professional. You want to keep your respect in your tone. And you want to use your best communication skills with your professor. One of the ways that you can also communicate with your professor if you don't feel comfortable going face-to-face is sending email. And there are certain things that you should follow when you are emailing your professor. So the first one is that you should always use the email address that your professor specifies and make sure that you are using your college email address. Don't use Hotmail or Gmail, and don't use an account that you created when you were much younger. There's nothing worse for professors than to get an email that doesn't tell them who the sender is. You also want to remember that you need to check your email regularly for messages from your professors. Many professors will send out information to reinforce what was taught in class, or maybe there is a point that they forgot about and they want to make sure you understand it. They may be assigning a new reading because maybe something new has come about that they have recently found out about. So you want to make sure that you're checking your email regularly for messages. The other thing is, when you're sending your professor a message, give them at least 24 hours in which to respond. Many professors are receiving lots of email, and a lot of professors check their email once or twice a day, and very few check it on weekends or in the evenings. So expect a delay if you send an email at 10 o'clock at night. You're probably not going to get a response immediately. Make sure you use a proper subject line so that the professor knows what you are talking about. And the subject line must always reflect what is in the body of your message. And begin your message with "Dear Professor," and then their names. Again, though, if the professor has said you can call me by my first name, then you can feel free to use that. Make sure your email is clear and concise as well. You don't want to spend a lot of time sending an email that rambles or doesn't get right to the point, because a lot of professors are looking specifically for what your point is so that they know how they need to answer. And make sure that you're using formal and easy to understand language. You also want to make sure that you are not using abbreviations like ASAP for quickly. You don't want to use non-standard spelling, so you want to make sure you're using Canadian spelling. And don't use slang or emoticons either, like smiley faces. It's not a good idea to make demands, so "get back to me by tomorrow," because again, you want to keep your tone respectful. If your professor has sent out a message to everyone and you're replying to that message, keep the original message in your reply. You want to make sure that you remain polite and respectful, and you want to end your message with a correct salutation. So "yours truly," or "sincerely yours," or "regards," "best wishes," and include your last name as well as your first name. It is a good idea as well, if English is not your first language, to write your message in a Word document first so that you can check your spelling and your grammar, and then copy and paste that message into the email. That way, you can proofread your message before sending it. If you're sending an attachment, it's always a good idea to double check and make sure that the attachment is there. One of the things that I always do if I am sending an attachment is I will write, "I have attached," pause, I add the attachment, and then go back and complete my message. Because there's nothing worse than sending a message without an attachment and having to resend the message. If you're feeling very emotional, so you're very angry or you're very upset or you're very sad, wait before you send your message. Wait at least an hour and then go back and check your message and make sure that it's polite and respectful before sending it. And again, be patient and wait for a response. There are times that we have difficulties with professors. It could be a personality conflict. It could be that we feel that they are discriminating against us. However, there are certain ways to handle it. The first one, of course, is to speak to the professor. So if you have a question, it's best to ask it sooner rather than later. So for example, if you have a question about an assignment that you did and why your mark is lower than you expected, don't wait till the end of the semester. And in a few minutes, we'll talk about how to resolve conflicts and how to approach your professors if there is a problem or you perceive a problem with your grades. Again, be prepared and plan your questions and comments in advance. And be respectful and communicate professionally. Remember that this is like a work relationship. You wouldn't go to your boss and say, "Why did you give me such a bad mark?" Because your boss could fire you. So remember, it's the same with your professors. You want to also remain open-minded and be ready to learn, because maybe there's something that you're doing incorrectly and your professor can tell you what it is. If you're open-minded and you're ready to learn, chances are that's going to help your grade. You also want to avoid whining or complaining or accusing the professor of discriminating against you, because this is a very serious accusation in North America. So you want to make sure that, again, you're polite and respectful. But finally, remember that there's no such thing as a stupid question unless you've asked the same question 4 times already. Now, when you're discussing low grades with professors, low grades are very upsetting for anyone. And believe me, we don't enjoy having to give low grades. We don't actually give low grades, you earn low grades. So if you have a low grade with the professor and you want to know why, don't try to discuss the grade before or after class. Because for one thing, you're discussing your grade in front of your classmates. We want to respect your privacy, so make an appointment with the professor. If you are doing a class remotely, then set up a Zoom meeting or some sort of meeting with your professor so that you can discuss your grade. So before making the appointment, make sure you go back and you review the requirements of the assignment or test, and also make sure that you read the professor's comments. You also want to make sure that you've gone through the rubric to see whether or not you've actually done what was required in the assignment. Once you've got the appointment, explain why you thought you did better on the assignment or test. Don't just say, "I deserve a better grade," or "I thought I would get a better grade." Explain why you think you should have gotten a better grade, or why you think you did better on the assignment than you actually did, and that you'd like to review it to understand the marks. Then allow the professor to explain the comments or the grading of the test or the assignment, and listen and be open to criticism. Don't think that we are criticizing you because we don't like you. We are criticizing the paper or the assignment or the test. So be open to these remarks so that you can do better on the next assignment. Also, you want to make sure that you're raising specific questions as the professor is explaining the assignment. Now, there's nothing wrong with going back to the professor afterwards and sending an email or saying, this is what I think you said. Is this correct? Or can you explain this in more detail? Make sure you're actually listening carefully to the explanation. A lot of times when we're listening to people, we're actually not fully listening. We're preparing what we are going to say next. So make sure that you are actually listening to the explanation and not preparing your next statement. Don't ever argue with your professor either, because we will often just end the discussion right there. Also, ask how you can improve your grade for the future. And again, don't leave all of your questions to the end of the semester. And when you are looking at your grades on eConestoga, You want to make sure that you are keeping track of your grades as well, so that at the end of the semester, you're not asking your professor why you don't have certain marks. Also, remember that there are often not make-up assignments to do. So you want to make sure at the beginning of the semester you understand exactly what your professor is expecting for the assignments. It's very easy to get angry over grades as well. And we all understand that because remember, professors have all been students. So if you are angry about a mark, don't immediately ask to talk to your professor because anger prevents clear thinking. So you want to make sure you've relaxed and had a chance to calm down before you discuss the grade. If, as you are having the discussion with your professor, you find yourself getting angry, remember things like deep breathing can help you calm down. If you need a moment, ask the professor to excuse you for a moment. And understand that a grade is not a personal issue of liking you or not. We are required to follow rubrics. So we don't give you a grade. We grade based on a rubric. If you meet the requirements of a certain level of the rubric, then you get a certain grade. And you are graded on what you are showing that you know at that time. And remember, grades are not a reflection of who you are as a person. A grade just reflects how well you have shown what you know. And always use poor grades as a learning opportunity. Remember, failure can be beneficial if we learn from failure. Now, there are times that as we are going through college, we run into difficulties. So it can be beneficial to have a mentor to help you through the difficult times while you are in college. And mentors are often someone who is older or more experienced. So maybe someone who has been in your program for a year, or maybe someone who has had different professors already or has taken certain courses. They can become a guide or an advisor or a role model for you. And a mentor is someone who is willing to help you and to talk to you about decisions you face and to support you when things are difficult. So you can have somebody who is an academic mentor. You can have someone who is a mentor in life. You can have a mentor in many different situations. And it's important to remember that these mentors can be someone who can become part of your network. And it does take time to actually find a mentor, but there are ways that you can use to find one. The first thing is to remember that this relationship develops over time. Some examples of people who could be a mentor are your coordinators, a professor you get along with well, a student who is older than you, or someone who has been in the program for longer, or a member of a different club that you belong to. If your program offers a formal mentorship program, it's a good idea to become involved with this because mentors can really help. But you can also network to find people to develop these relationships with. Now I want to turn to relating to professors in online courses. If you are taking an asynchronous course, this means that everything is done online and there's very limited contact with your professor. If you are taking a synchronous course online, that means that there is face-to-face time with the professor. So it may be a Zoom meeting or other types of meetings. But remember that while some classes have FaceTime or Zoom meetings or live audio connections, many do not if it's an asynchronous course. So you want to make sure that you're using the email or bulletin boards to communicate with your professor, but communicate in the method that they prefer. Also remember that most communication is written. You may not be able to actually have a face-to-face interaction with these professors because online asynchronous classes often have far more students than an online synchronous or even an in-class session. So you want to make sure that you take the initiative to communicate with your professor. This way, you are setting up a relationship with the professor, because unless there is a face-to-face component, students remain anonymous, and it's hard to get to know who your students are as a professor unless they communicate with you. You also need to remember that if it's an asynchronous and totally online class, it's up to you to remain motivated and to get the work done. And again, if there's information you don't understand, you want to make sure you're communicating with your professor. So when you're communicating with your professor online, in an online class, you want to make sure that you write clearly. They don't know who you are, so you need to make sure that you communicate anything you do in a clear manner. You also want to make sure that you're using your critical thinking skills, which we have discussed before. You want to make sure that you take the initiative and ask questions directly and seek help. Be patient as you're waiting for answers as well. I have seen professors who teach online courses who have 100 or more students. So getting through email in one class can take a lot of time. You also want to make sure that you are interacting with other students. Set up a network, set up a study group, whatever it takes, because getting to know other students can also help you get through the course, because maybe there's something they understand and you don't. Or it could also be a case of the students having knowledge that you don't and being able to share that knowledge. Now, part of many classes is a class presentation. When we are doing a class presentation, I honestly can't think of anything that is much worse than this situation. Because class presentations means that you are standing in front of your peers, your fellow students, and we all feel anxious to some degree, or most of us do. And anxiety can prevent us from performing very well. So it's important to remember that or understand where this anxiety is coming from. And before you start your presentation, use some of the mindfulness techniques that we've talked about to help reduce your anxiety level. And understand that your audience wants you to succeed. Because if you have difficulty and you forget something and you become embarrassed, often audience members also become embarrassed for you because we really don't want to see you fail. One way that you can reduce your anxiety is by making sure that you have prepared well and you've practiced your presentation before you actually do it. So write a script out. Practice going through your script. The more you know your script, the better it's going to be, because anxiety is not going to interfere with your memory. If you don't practice your presentation a lot, it stays in your short-term memory. And we know that our short-term memory is highly affected by anxiety. So if you practice a lot, the information goes into your long-term memory, which is less affected by anxiety. You want to focus on what you're saying too. What is the message that you want to get across? Don't focus on how you're saying it, focus on what you're saying. And if you're really, really anxious or self-conscious about doing a presentation, and you don't have a lot of self-confidence, then try to find someone who you can practice your presentation in front of so that you boost your self-confidence before doing a presentation. Now, there are some guidelines for presentations as well. And the first one is you need to analyze your audience and your goals. So what do you want to teach them? So in our class, in the 1800 class, you do group presentations on topics that we have already discussed in class. So you want to analyze what we've already studied and decide what new information you want to present. And what are your goals for this presentation? What do you want your audience to walk away knowing? You want to make sure that you plan and you research and you organize your materials in a logical way so that your audience understands. And just like a writing assignment, you want to draft and you want to revise the presentation. You also want to make sure that you make speaking notes that are in point form because you don't want to be reading your presentation. You also don't want to be reading your PowerPoint slides as you are making your presentation. You will notice that with my presentations, I have my key points, but then I elaborate on those using my speaking notes. And again, you want to practice your presentation. The more you practice, the more comfortable you will be before you actually make the presentation. And finally, when you're delivering the presentation, you want to speak slowly and clearly. And remember that you are the one who has the knowledge, and we are the ones who want to learn that knowledge. So you are the teacher when it comes to the presentation. Now, when you're making a group presentation, you want to make sure that as soon as you have the topic, that you schedule a group meeting as soon as possible. And then as a group, you want to analyze your audience and your goals and what the assignment is. You may even want to assign roles to people in the group. So you may want someone who organizes the meetings. You may want to have someone who acts as the secretary and takes notes during the meetings. You may have somebody, who is going to create the PowerPoint slides. You will want to divide the topic up into small chunks, and each person takes a chunk. You also want to make sure that you're staying in touch with your group members regularly. If you don't, what may happen is that one person winds up doing all of the work in the group, and you don't want that. Everyone needs to contribute equally. Before preparing your notes, you also want to meet to review the content of your presentation and the visuals that are created. And make sure when you are creating PowerPoint slides or a Prezi presentation that you're all using the same theme throughout. There's nothing worse than going to a group presentation and each person has an individual slide deck. You want to make sure that everyone uses the same slide deck. And when you're making the presentation, you want to make sure you have one person responsible for changing the slides. So the chapter takeaways for this chapter 7 are: you want to make sure that you actively engage in your education because this is going to make you more successful. You want to attend class, you want to participate in class, and you want to communicate with your professors. You benefit enormously by participating in class and by asking questions because you listen actively. When you are preparing to participate in class as well, you want to make sure you've done the preparation ahead of time, that you've done the readings, that you've done the necessary questions that the professor may have assigned before class. But you want to make sure that you are ready for the class so that when you are there, you can participate and you can work on your communication skills. Remember that getting to know your professor and networking with your professor can help you in the future and may even help you find a mentor. Presentations are a part of most classes, and these help you develop key communication skills, and they help you become better at making presentations. You also want to remember that working well in a group is a key element of your college and your career success. So this is chapter 7. I hope this helps, and I'll see you in class.